I still remember those days vividly. Our computer shop was tiny, almost like a kiosk, but for the locals it was the center of the universe. People brought in their computers, laptops, printers, anything that had stopped working. Sometimes they would just come to ask for advice, and we were like doctors, but for electronics. I actually loved that part, walking into a customer's home, seeing the panic in their eyes because everything is broken, and then, half an hour later, leaving them smiling, thanking me as if I had just saved their life. That sense of being useful kept me going for a while. But working under that boss was an ordeal. He was a man of moods. 1 hour he could be cracking jokes, the next he was yelling that I did everything wrong. On a bad day he always needed a scapegoat, and most often it was me. Even when the mistake was entirely his. If an order hadn't been placed, it was because I supposedly forgot. I'd try to remind him that he himself told me to delay it, but he would just sneer, "Don't lie, you messed it up again." What could I do? He was the owner. And worse than that, he always compared me with former employees. When Sasha worked here, he was much faster. Petya could finish in half the time. The irony was, I had heard him say the exact opposite about those same people before I joined, that Sasha was too slow, that Petya was incompetent. But this was his trick, to guilt-trip whoever worked for him at the moment, make them feel like they were never good enough. One day, when he was in an especially foul mood, he invented a brilliant new rule. "From now on," he said, "you must text me every time you arrive at a customer's place, and every time you finish. And you cannot go anywhere until I give you permission. Clear?" I asked, half joking, "Even if I have to wait an hour?" He looked me straight in the eyes, "Even 3. Even 5. Rules are rules." So I obeyed. Day 1, I texted him when I arrived. Waited for his reply. He said, "Okay." Finished the job, texted again. Waited. Sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes 10. Sitting in the customer's driveway with nothing to do. My frustration simmered, but I told myself, don't complain. Do exactly what he asked. Let him choke on his own rules. On the second day, after lunch, the absurdity reached its peak. I arrived at the first customer, texted, "I'm here." He replied quickly. I fixed the laptop, simple job, half an hour. Then I texted, "Finished." Silence. 5 minutes passed. 10. I called him. No answer. I sat back down. What else could I do? The rule was the rule. So I sat under a tree, in the summer heat, watching people walk by. At first I was nervous, glancing at my phone. Then I relaxed. Watched some videos, scrolled social media, chatted with friends. An hour passed. 2. Almost 3 hours later, my phone finally rang. His voice was furious, "Where the hell are you?" Calmly I answered, "Still at the customer's." He nearly choked, "Still? That was your first client after lunch. The day is almost over." I replied, "You told me not to leave without your permission." You didn't reply, so I waited. When I returned, he exploded, "Why so long? You're unbearably slow." I looked him in the eyes, "I followed your rule. You told me to wait. I would never disobey an order." He froze, speechless. Then mumbled something like, "Well, you should use common sense. If I don't reply, it means I'm busy." Later I found out he had been at home all day dealing with contractors, and completely forgot he had given me this brilliant new rule. Needless to say, he never brought it up again. But the complaints about me being too slow never stopped. Some things never change. That was the first time I truly tasted malicious compliance. Doing exactly what you're told, word for word, until the absurdity of the order crushes the one who gave it. And that wasn't even the first time I'd experienced something like this. When I was 16, I had just gotten my driver's license, and to me the car felt like freedom itself. The very first time I sat behind the wheel alone, my heart was pounding like I was about to launch into space. My parents asked me to go to the store for groceries. I did the shopping, and on the way back thought, why not swing by my friend's house for 5 minutes, just to show him I'm driving solo now. For a teenager, that was a big deal. But at home, a storm was waiting. My stepmother, Mary Ann, lost her mind. We didn't give you permission to go to Bill's. We said the store and straight back. I tried to explain that the day before they had allowed me to visit my other friend, Matt, so I thought it wasn't an issue. That only made them angrier. They announced a new ironclad rule: you have no right to drive anywhere except where we specifically allow you. Period. 3 days later, my 13-year-old stepsister Tina was being an absolute menace all day. Then, right before evening, she sweetly said, "Brian, time to drive me to ballet." Usually that was my duty, 3 times a week. But I remembered the rule. I smiled and said, "Sorry, Tina. Mom and Dad didn't give me permission. I can't." At first she thought I was joking. Then came the screaming, the crying, the begging, the threats. She called Mom, left a message. Called Dad, left another. The clock ticked, her class began, and I just sat there, nerves jangling but resolute. When Marian came home, Tina rushed to her in tears. "Why are you here? You're supposed to be at ballet." They argued, then Marian stomped down the hall and yelled, "Just wait until your father comes home." I nearly laughed. When Dad finally walked in, both of them pounced on him, talking over each other about how awful I was. I sat in my room, bracing for the worst. 10 minutes later, he called me out. "Brian," he said, "you played us. And we can't argue with it. Let's make a new deal." They admitted they'd gone too far. They admitted Tina wasn't always fair to me. And they said from now on, I could drive where I wanted, within reason. I walked back to my room with the widest grin on my face. Another victory, courtesy of Malicious compliance. I thought I had finally found a decent job when I landed a position as a digital marketer at a mid-sized company. The CEO seemed approachable during the interview, spoke about trust, development, and how he needed someone proactive to fix the mess left by the previous VP of marketing. At the time, I didn't fully realize what kind of mess it was. It turned out that the VP and his 4-person team had managed to burn through over $1 million of the budget in just a year. The result? 5 deals. 2 of which barely scratched $10,000 each. I stared at the reports in disbelief, feeling like someone was pulling an elaborate joke on me. So there I was, one man with a laptop, a couple of paid tools, and a stack of free services, tasked with rebuilding the entire marketing department. No team, no assistant, no safety net. Just me, doing the work of 5 people: SEO, content, ads, analytics, copywriting, even design. At first, I took it as a challenge. It was my chance to prove myself. I worked day and night. Tested ads, rewrote landing pages, ran A/B tests, fine-tuned keywords, optimized funnels. I became obsessed with squeezing value out of every dollar. And I did it. Within months, using less than 10% of the previous budget, I had already surpassed last year's results. More leads, higher conversions, better ROI. When I handed in my reports, the CEO smiled and said, "All credit goes to you. If there's ever a mistake, the blame is mine. Don't worry, the best is the enemy of the good. Keep it simple, as long as it works." Back then, I believed him. I thought I had a boss who understood. But those words turned out to be empty. As time went on, I began to see how he treated others. He would rip into managers for minor mistakes, humiliate HR staff in front of everyone, yell at accounting for delays measured in minutes. I realized he wasn't a leader. He was a bully with a smile he wore only when it benefited him. He slipped a few times with me, too. Once because of a typo in a client email. Another time because a report was delayed when the CRM crashed. Both times, he yelled until his face was red, then a couple of hours later came back, sheepishly muttering, "Sorry, I lost my temper." But the damage was done. I had seen his real face. The pattern became obvious. I was only valuable as long as I kept performing miracles. The moment I faltered, I'd be disposable, just like the VP before me. Then came the day of the big campaign. We'd spent weeks preparing. I had warned him several times that the timeline was unrealistic, that testing was rushed, that the creative was unfinished. But he insisted, "We launched tomorrow. No excuses." So we launched. And of course, things went wrong. Not catastrophically, but enough to notice: low click-through rates, underperforming creatives, a few technical hiccups. Immediately, he stormed into my office. "Why the hell are the numbers so bad? What are you even doing here?" I reminded him calmly that I had warned about the risks, that I had suggested a phased rollout. He didn't want to hear it. "Don't make excuses. Fix it now." And that's when the idea hit me. If he wanted to play by malicious rules, then fine. I'd play along. I fixed the bugs, but deliberately left everything exactly as he had approved it. No optimizations, no tweaks, no rescue moves. Just his campaign, as is. A week later, the results came in: total disaster. Leads cost 4 times more than expected, ROI in the red, budget bleeding. He looked like he was about to explode. He demanded explanations. I pulled up the emails where I had outlined all the risks, the presentations where I had flagged every issue, and the recordings of calls where he had shut me down. He was cornered. Couldn't pin it on me. Couldn't yell his way out. Everyone saw it. And yet, even then, he didn't learn. He just got quieter, more bitter, muttering under his breath about me being too slow, not aggressive enough. The same script he had used with the VP before me. That was the day I realized the truth: some bosses don't want solutions. They want scapegoats. And the best way to deal with them isn't to fight, it's to let their own arrogance drag them down. I didn't quit that day. Not yet. But I knew my time was limited. Every time he barked an impossible order, every time he ignored my advice, I just thought to myself, one day, you'll choke on your own rules. And I'll be free. By the time I got to that third story in my life, I was already well trained in the art of malicious compliance. But nothing prepared me for the way this one played out, because it happened inside my own family. And family rules are trickier than workplace nonsense. It all began with my stepmother's obsession with control. Mary Ann had this need to establish authority in every little detail of the household. She would make up new rules out of thin air, and my dad would usually just nod along to avoid conflict. I was a teenager then, already stubborn, already testing boundaries. Which meant I became her favorite target. She had a way of talking that sounded logical, but the more you thought about it, the more absurd it became. For example, she once declared that I was not allowed to sit in the living room after 9 p.m., because it was family time. I asked her, "Aren't I part of the family?" She just gave me that tight-lipped smile and said, "Not in the way you think." That was Mary Ann, sharp edges hidden under fake sweetness. One evening, after dinner, she laid down yet another rule. From now on, she announced, you are not to answer the phone unless it's specifically for you. Do you understand? I raised an eyebrow. Even if it's ringing and no one else is around? She nodded. Even then. If it's important, they'll call back. I said nothing. Just tucked the rule into the back of my mind. A week later, my chance came. Dad was waiting for an important business call, something about a contractor and a deadline. He had told everyone in the house, if the phone rings, make sure I get it. But Marian was out, and Dad had stepped into the garage. The phone rang. Loud. Urgent. I looked at it, then at the garage door. The rule echoed in my mind, you are not to answer the phone unless it's for you. So I didn't. I let it ring. And ring. And ring. Finally, it stopped. Dad came back inside a few minutes later. Did anyone call? He asked. I shrugged. Yes. But Marian said I'm not allowed to answer unless it's for me. His face froze. He realized instantly what had happened. When Marian got home, Dad tore into her like I'd never seen before. Do you realize your ridiculous rule just cost me a deal? He followed it to the letter, and you're to blame. She tried to protest, but for once, he didn't let her. He told her flat out that her power games had gone too far. From that day on, the no answering the phone rule disappeared forever. And though she tried to come up with new ones later, Dad was a little more cautious about enforcing them. That was my family life, constantly walking the fine line between obedience and rebellion, using their own logic against them when the moment was right. But malicious compliance wasn't only for home or work. Sometimes it slipped into everyday life, little acts of defiance that nobody even noticed until the consequences hit. Like the time a teacher told us we could only use the textbooks and nothing else for our research papers. Everyone else groaned, but I followed that instruction exactly. I built my entire paper by copying line after line from the assigned book, cited every page, and handed it in. The teacher was furious. "This is plagiarism," she shouted. I calmly pointed out that she had specifically forbidden any sources outside the textbook. She had boxed herself in with her own rule. She had no choice but to give me a passing grade, though the look she gave me promised revenge. Life taught me early, authority often collapses under the weight of its own arrogance. All you need to do is give it a little nudge. And every time I pulled it off, I felt that same quiet thrill. That satisfaction of doing exactly what they asked, while showing them how foolish their demands really were. By the time the fourth story unfolded, I had already lived through office meltdowns, step-parent tyranny, and classroom absurdities. But nothing prepared me for the way malicious compliance would taste in the military. That environment was built on rules, discipline, and hierarchy, a perfect breeding ground for leaders who thought their word was divine law. And one of them, Captain Harris, was about to teach me a lesson he'd regret. Harris was the type of officer who loved the sound of his own voice. He barked orders not because they made sense but because he wanted to hear silence afterward. To him, silence equaled respect. He had a habit of reminding us, if I give an order, you follow it to the letter, no matter what. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about dominance. One scorching summer afternoon, we were ordered to clean out the supply hangar. The place was stacked floor to ceiling with gear, crates of tools, boxes of parts, tents, you name it. Normally, this job would take a couple of days with a forklift and a detailed plan. But Harris, in all his wisdom, barked, "Everything out, now. Stack it outside by size and color." I want it done by the end of the day. We exchanged looks. Size and color? In military supply? That made no sense. But we remembered his golden rule, follow the order to the letter. So that's what we did. We dragged every box and crate outside, sweating under the sun, stacking them like some kind of giant Lego set. Large green crates here, smaller brown boxes there, mismatched odds and ends sorted by vague shades of gray and tan. It looked like a bizarre art installation. Hours later, Harris came to inspect. At first, he smirked, clearly ready to gloat. But then he saw it, the entire hangar empty, every last item stacked neatly in the blazing sun. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. "Exactly what you ordered, sir," I replied. "Everything out, stacked by size and color." By end of day. He looked around, realizing the consequences. Sensitive equipment now sat baking in the heat. Tents that should have been kept dry were on the ground. Boxes of tools were exposed to dust and sand. It was a logistical nightmare of his own making. He exploded. "Are you idiots trying to ruin government property?" I stood at attention. "Sir, with all due respect, we followed your order exactly." That was the moment he understood he couldn't pin it on us. He had witnesses, too many of them. The sergeants were smirking behind their hands. Everyone knew Harris had brought this on himself. From that day forward, his orders came with more caveats, more hesitations. "Well, I mean, just make sure it's done properly." He never admitted defeat, but he learned. And I walked away with the quiet satisfaction of knowing malicious compliance worked even in the strictest system. Later, during my service, I saw the same pattern repeat. Officers who insisted on absurd routines, rules that ignored logic, leaders who confused stubbornness with strength. Every time, the cure was simple: follow the order exactly. The system eats itself when you stop trying to fix it. Years later, when I was no longer in uniform, I looked back on that moment with Harris as the purest example of malicious compliance. It wasn't about rebellion for the sake of rebellion. It was about exposing the fragility of authority built on ego instead of reason. I learned something vital: you don't always need to fight openly. Sometimes the most powerful weapon you have is obedience sharpened into a blade. By the time the fifth story came around, I had already sharpened my instinct for spotting arrogance wrapped in authority. I thought I'd seen it all: bosses, stepmothers, teachers, even military officers. But sometimes the stage isn't grand at all. Sometimes malicious compliance happens in the smallest corners of life, in those everyday interactions where someone insists on having their way without thinking through the consequences. This one took place in my first apartment building after I moved out on my own. It was a crumbling, drafty block with thin walls and neighbors who treated the hallway like their personal lounge. Among them was Mrs. Kramer, the self-proclaimed queen of the tenants. She wasn't the landlord, but she acted like one. She'd make announcements in the lobby, slip notes under doors about rules she invented, and generally harass anyone who didn't follow her imaginary code of conduct. One day, she decided that nobody was allowed to use the shared laundry room after 7 p.m. She pinned up a typed note on the bulletin board: "Laundry room closes at 7 p.m. This is for the good of the community." There was no such rule in the lease, and the landlord never backed it. But Mrs. Kramer enforced it with religious zeal, stomping into the laundry room at 7 sharp to scold anyone still washing their clothes. Normally, I'd ignore someone like that. But one evening, I came home from work around 6:30 with a basket full of dirty clothes. I barely had time to start 2 loads before the clock struck 7. And sure enough, like a bad omen, Mrs. Kramer appeared. "You'll need to turn those off," she said sternly. "Laundry is prohibited after 7. I sighed, tired from the day, and decided to give her exactly what she wanted. "Of course," I said. I walked over, pressed the stop button on both machines, and left the wet, soapy clothes sitting there. "Happy now?" Her smirk told me everything. She thought she'd won. The next morning, I returned at 6 a.m. sharp, the earliest allowed by the actual lease agreement, and restarted the wash. By then, the wet clothes had sat all night, and the sour smell filled the entire laundry room. And because the machines weren't finished, nobody else could use them until my loads were done. The complaints started rolling in by noon. The landlord had to investigate. When I explained what happened, that I was following the rule Mrs. Kramer had imposed, the landlord was furious. Not at me, but at her. "There is no such rule, and you don't make policies here," he told her in front of several tenants. Her reign ended that day. She still lived in the building, but her printed notes stopped appearing. The laundry room became a quiet, neutral ground again. And all it took was one act of perfect obedience to her nonsense. That's what I've realized about malicious compliance. It isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle, almost invisible, like letting wet clothes sour in a washer overnight because someone demanded control. The beauty lies in the inevitability, their own rule turning into their downfall. Looking back now, I can connect the dots. From the offices where CEOs blamed everyone but themselves, to the classrooms where teachers tried to box us in, to the suffocating grip of step-parents and the rigid absurdities of military orders, the pattern was always the same. Authority without wisdom collapses. All you have to do is let it. And so, each story, each moment of compliance, became a small rebellion dressed as obedience. Not shouting, not fighting, just a quiet mirror held up to their faces, forcing them to see the cracks in their own logic. That's the true power of malicious compliance. It doesn't break the rules. It bends them so perfectly that they break themselves.